Welcome everybody to the online causal inference seminar. Today it's the third time we're doing something different from the regular seminars where we are interviewing a distinguished scholar in the area of causal inference. After we've had Esther Duflo about a month ago and Don Rubin a couple of weeks ago. Now we're very happy to have Judea Pearl here today from UCLA. I've known Judea since the early 90s when he gave some talks at Harvard University on causal inference on directed acyclical graphs, and he actually gave a guest lecture in my class with Don Rubin there, which was a lot of fun. And I've followed his work and multiple books he's since written about causal inference with great interest. So it's with great pleasure that we have Judea Pearl here today for an hour. And so we'll be asking him some questions. We'll start with the panel, Michael Celentio, Dominique Rothenhauser, and Thomas Richardson asking some questions. The audience should also feel free to send some questions through the chat, through the Q&A. And we'll try to bring up some of those as well. But to start off with, in your interview after you got the Turing Award in 2011, you talked a little bit about the early influence of your mentors and early teachers. Can you say a little bit more about that and kind of what it was that made you decide on a career in science, and in particular in computer science?
I never neglect to pay tribute to my high school teachers, because looking back, they were really giants. And these were professors that came in the 1930s when Hitler came to power. And they had to leave their jobs and migrate to Israel, and couldn't find a job in academia, and found themselves teaching in high school. And I think because they understood that they will never publish a paper again and never conduct experiments and continue their career, they saw in us the fulfillment of their dreams. And they invested in us a lot, all their knowledge and commitment to science and the love and the joy of discovery. So I was a product of the most daring educational experiments in history. Where would you find a professor spending his career in high school, teaching high school students? And that should be also coupled with the fact that I grew up in a time of a nation-building period where the culture was totally geared into do it yourself or else it won't be done. Namely, everything that needed to be done had to be done by ourselves with no expertise, education, transportation, water supply. Everything had to be done by people who were not exactly expert in those fields. My grandfather was a merchant in Poland, and he became a dairyman. He was sent to Damascus to buy cows. Because it had to be done. No one would do it otherwise. So that psyche, I think, affected my attitude toward science. Namely, there is respect for authority, but not total submission to authority.
Not be intimidated.
Understanding that you should do things yourself, or else, if you don't understand things, don't trust the authorities.
Yeah, so don't be intimidated by the authorities.
Intimidation, correct.
So what made you go into computer science?
Well, that was by coincidence. I went to engineering. Well, I wanted to become a farmer, agronome, and I was a member of the kibbutz, and I planned to spend my life in a kibbutz. But then somebody told me that if you like mathematics, you better go to and study electrical engineering, and that's what I did. I went to the Technion and studied electrical engineering, which was a very good education, also taught by giants of the field. And then when we came here to do the graduate works, it was the beginning of the computer age, and everybody understood that computers are going to replace human beings. And in all aspects, it was only a question of when. And this was in 1960. I remember in the 1960s, we worked already on associative memories, on perception, things that even today have not been solved. The atmosphere, the culture was computer is going to replace us. We better be the first. So that's how I got to the computer science field. My early work was on superconducting memories, and when semiconductors took over, I had no job, so I joined the UCLA. At that time, you know that the industry looked down upon academia. What can academicians do? And indeed, you know, the location of innovation was Bell Lab in Fairchild camera. It wasn't academia. That's what the laser was invented, and the transistor was invented. So I had easy time to get into UCLA because I came from industry, the innovative industry. And that's where I find myself in computer science, doing pattern recognition and other things. And then expert system came.
So Yehuda, I think many people in this audience probably are familiar with your work on graphical causal models, but not all of them may know that you initially worked on heuristics. So can you tell us just a little bit about how that work and how it connected?
Yeah, heuristic was a great era because game playing was the arena where ideas in artificial intelligence were tested. And I looked at game playing as a beautiful laboratory for the interplay between system 1 and system 2, in talking in terms of Kahneman two systems. System 1 is we have perception, and you have immediate explicit understanding of how strong is the board position. And system 2 is deliberate logic and derivations that we find in reasoning. That's what we call reasoning. Now, game playing, you had this interplay where you search forward, you look at the horizon, there you apply your perception and roll back and inform the next step to take. So this interplay between perception and reasoning was a terrific laboratory. And I liked it because, there was a question of automatic generation of heuristics. I did some work and proving that certain algorithm, game playing algorithm is optimal, like alpha, beta. Yeah, I think it was a good laboratory for flashing out ideas. But then expert system came and I quit.
So moving on to that, one of the things, again, that may be surprising to people in this audience is that, so I regard one of your contributions as being one of the pioneers that convinced computer scientists to go back to using probability theory, that there was a period where there was a movement to sort of certainty factors, and people were unsure whether or not probability theory was really a suitable framework for expert systems. So could you just say a little bit about what those days were like? Because it's probably very surprising to people here to think about that.
No, the field started with logic. Namely, you have rules that dictates what inferences should do. Socrates is a man, and men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. And they try to capture expertise using rules. Unfortunately, they had to deal with uncertainty because most rules have exceptions. And how to deal with exceptions was the major problem. And you don't want to enumerate the exceptions, but you want to still to count them. And they try to decorate rules with uncertainty and then put them together by some heuristics. But it didn't work well because they couldn't capture the two elements. They couldn't capture the explain away and the chaining. I'll give you a simple example. If you say that if the ground is wet, then it rained. Then if the sprinkler is on, then the ground is wet. Therefore, if I turn the sprinkler on, it rained. Okay, that's a simple chaining where you mixed up evidential rule with causal rule, and it didn't work out. Okay, so another one was explaining away, even in this example. But there was no loss of ideas. The fuzzy logic was there. There was the Dempster-Schaeffer theory of belief functions, and there was a period where everybody thought that handling of uncertainty needs to have a new ideas and new logic. So everybody invented his or her new logic for uncertainty. And I came from, I would say, I was influenced by teaching decision analysis. I was influenced by Rafa and Kinney and Howard and Ferguson. So once I taught decision analysis and Savage, I was convinced that the right way of handling uncertainty, I was biased, I should say, not convinced. I was biased by something that is that probability theory not only gives you interpretation for handling uncertainty, but also captures it's a good guardian of coherence. And so I was biased, and I tried to introduce probability theory, which fell into ill repute at the time. Everybody was convinced that probability is unfit to do expert system. And the reason was because you do indeed need to have super exponential tables if you want to enlist all the probability tables the way you teach it in high school, right? What is probability model? Probability model is a table of all possible instantiation of the variables and decorated with the numbers that sum to 1. Indeed, if you have 1,000 variables, you already exceed the number of molecules in the world, so it's impossible. So everybody understood we need to have something else. Probability won't work. But since I was biased for probability, I tried to make it work despite the fact that you have this exponential explosion. And luckily, I was able to, luckily I fell into trees. And in tree structures, you can have a uncertainty propagation asynchronously And I could answer questions by belief propagations without even need to program things. So once I got into the tree structures, I felt that there is a way of simplifying the probability calculus using graphs, okay, where you have uncertainty, handshaking between top-down and bottom-up modes of reasoning, and you can capture things starting not with probability tables, but with graphs. Because conditional independence is what gives you the power to simplify things and to perform and beat the exponential explosion that tables dictate. So that was the time of early 1980s, where we got into graphical models. And once the Bayesian networks were formulated, everybody worked on correct loopy Bayesian network.
So how did you start thinking about causality then?
Causality came later. Okay, once we developed the Bayesian network and it was successful, and we thought, I thought, other people may have a different idea. I thought that causality is just a shorthand notation for patterns of independencies. So instead of saying, look at this pattern, you can say, okay, X causes B, okay? Or X does not cause C, okay? Which is a shorthand notation for patterns of independency. That's how we thought about it in the Bayesian network days. Okay? But then we looked backward and everything was causal. The reason that it was successful was that we modeled the disease, we didn't model the doctor. And we modeled the interplay or the handshaking between top-down and bottom-up. But what was top-down and bottom-up? It was causal versus evidential. Okay? So everything was causal, but we didn't know that cause and effect needs to have a special calculus. We thought it's just it's mental gimmicks. I even wrote papers there in 1988, when my book on probabilistic reasoning came out. I wrote papers about embracing causality in default logic. Okay, yeah, and we look at the success, and success came from reconfigurability. It was easier to reconfigure the system, and what accounts for reconfigurability? Modularity, and that's a causal property. But we didn't articulate it as causal property. It was just in the back of our mind. We use the causal language, and we look at the causal language as just a shorthand convenience for something else. Then intervention came, and that I learned from Spiritus, from Peter Spiritus in Uppsala, that he showed how you can do intervention using cutting the edges in a graph. Then it became a new game. Intervention could be emulated on the graph, and we had all the machinery for graph. So everything that we developed in graph theory, zoop, could be borrowed and be used and amortized when we talked about intervention. So that was the click that moved me into causal reasoning. And I understood that it's a new species. It deserves its own calculus, its own notation. It's a new species.
Well, I think that's a very interesting history. So how was were your ideas about causal inference first received by the computer science community?
Extremely well, surprisingly well. And you know why? I'll tell you why. Because computer scientists are used to changing languages on a weekly basis. Right? So they're not tied to, they don't feel allegiance or loyalty to a language. And when I came to them with the do calculus, I remember Niels Nielsen sitting in the audience and say, now I understand it. So tell me more. Is it conditioned after the treatment? And it was a terrifically welcoming reception to the idea because they were interested in the calculus of action, marry it with the calculus of observations. They were totally open to it. Vladimir Lifshitz and his friends, right, implemented it the next year using default logic, okay, with the programming languages, okay. Extremely good reception from a computer scientist. Not so in a statistical way. I first presented the relationship between the backdoor criterion and Rubin's ignorability things in Florence in 1993, and people were totally lost. They didn't understand a word, and they told me so. We don't understand what you're talking about. And I came to them and said, but look, Rubin's theory is in statistics, right? And the name of this session is Causal Reasoning in Statistics. How come we don't put the two together? And it was a total blank faces. And statisticians were then resentful. Rubin saw it as a threat. And the thing that broke the ice was a daring editor called Philip David. And he invited me to give this paper in 1995 in Biometrica. Okay? I think despite bad reviews and with the discussions that my friend Invens participated and other things. But
yeah, I think I also wrote one of the reviews, so.
Well, negative reviews, okay. And but notice that particular decision by a daring and enlightened editor made history because it introduced graph theory and the do calculus to the statistical community, to at least the Biometrica readership, right? And it made history. Okay? I know that you're editor of Econometrica, right? So take it as a hint. There's a lot that editors can do and should do. But so that is, I think, what broke the ice at that time.
That's a very interesting perspective. Thank you. I think let's talk a bit more about graphs, perhaps. So some scientists, they might hesitate a bit writing down a graph because for some of the variables, they might worry about manipulability. So for example, if you take body mass index, they might worry that they don't exactly know how to intervene on that, or if you change it, like different interventions might have different effects. You have a very interesting perspective on manipulability. So there was a quote from an interview where you said, the requirement of manipulability, even in theory, has led to some weird results in causal inference. Can you perhaps tell us a bit more about your perspective here?
It led to what?
Has led to some weird results in causal inference. So you said the requirement of
I couldn't get what you said, but it was the most oppressive and stifling idea that I had in causal inference. Okay. Now, let's look at the history of causal inference, or even counterfactual. The first time that you have counterfactual in the Bible was with Abraham, right? If there were 50 righteous people in the city, I would not destroy it, God says. What if there were 50 righteous? Is that manipulable? Let's look at the Greek mythology, okay, or Greek history writing, right? We're talking about Thucydides, okay, when he explained the tsunami in one of the islands there, he said, if it were not for the earthquake, I wouldn't be able to explain how the flood could how could the flood cover that kind of area. Okay, so here you talk about two phenomena. One is God's decision about if there were 50 righteous people. The other one is an earthquake. None of them is manipulable. Okay, so in our mind, counterfactuals are not manipulable. They are references to alternative world. Okay. That is the origin of our conception of counterfactual. So where the hell did you get the idea of manipulability? Very late, because statisticians could not deal with causality except under controlled randomized experiments. It's artificial constraints. Okay, that is my story about manipulability.
So can I push back on that a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of settings where the questions of interest are about causality, are about what is the effect of this manipulation. Policymakers want to know, they want to predict what would happen if they change something. And so then at that point, the link to having something be manipulable is very natural.
Not only natural, it's explicit. If your query is, what is the effect of this policy, then your query is already manipulative. Fine. But if your query is non-manipulative, like the DAGs, the construction of the DAGs is nothing to do with manipulation. It has to do with who listens to whom. What is the effect of earthquake? If it was not for the earthquake, my house was still going to be intact. This is an example of a non-manipulable cause which has effects that are of interest. Okay, so manipulation only comes when you want to interrogate nature. Manipulation is a way of interrogating nature, which in itself, by itself, is non-manipulative. One variable listens to another. The variations in one variable are transferred into another by virtue of cosmic radiation, but not necessarily man-made manipulation, not even manipulation that we can name.
But Judah, there are circumstances. Often my impression is that in social sciences and other areas, the progress often arises when people realize that there's a first stage where people can measure something. For example, in your case, they might be able to detect that there's an earthquake. But then subsequently, when the real progress comes about is when people then realize that there are different ways that one might manipulate the effect. For example, changing years of education. There are many ways we could change years of education. You could keep people in school longer, or you could start them earlier, or you could take them back to school. And often the details of those manipulations matter greatly, that if we just have a variable and we say years of education and we're going to manipulate that, it makes a great deal whether this is by early education or whether it's by keeping people in school longer or providing them with incentives to stay in school. I mean, your earthquake example, we know, right, there are shallow earthquakes and there are deep earthquakes, and the details of which kind of earthquake have enormous consequences. And part of the process of coming up with a a detailed causal system is to be able to articulate the differences between those different kinds of interventions. So isn't there a danger that if we simply assume that as soon as we can measure something, we know what it is to manipulate it, then in some sense we are glossing over a very important step in formulating a scientific theory?
On the contrary, because physical manipulations have side effects. So how you manipulate things makes a difference. We want to have a standard that is free of all these versions of manipulation. So you want to know what the effect of cholesterol on life expectancy, and you cannot change the cholesterol directly. You can do it by exercise, by diet, and other things. Each one has its own side effect. So you're talking about the effect of cholesterol itself in order to present a standard. How you do it? Each version of manipulation has its own side effect, and you can, if you have knowledge of them, you can incorporate them in the system. But scientists, in order to be able to transfer knowledge from one domain to another, needs to know the effect of cholesterol on life expectancy, not of diet. It is the effect of cholesterol on life expectancy, which is transferable from Africa to Australia. How we manipulate is not transferable. And that is the importance of intermediate states and talking about the do calculus and the do operator. It's standard and it's transferable.
But your example with cholesterol is very interesting because people for a long time thought that cholesterol was one thing, and they had drugs that sort of would affect cholesterol, and then subsequently it was discovered that actually there were two kinds of cholesterol: a good cholesterol and a bad cholesterol, and that in fact, you know, whereas people thought it was one thing that they were intervening on, there were in fact two things they were intervening on, and some treatments affected the good cholesterol, and some treatments affected the bad cholesterol. So, you know, isn't there a problem that people think they know what it is to intervene on a variable and maybe they don't?
And this discovery came about because people assume that you have one constant cholesterol and did experiments accordingly.
Okay, so a connected question here. Do you think that inference, so statistical questions of inference, sort of trying to determine whether an effect is, how large the effect is, should those be treated separately from identification questions? What's your thought on that? By
definition, because identification doesn't need data. Identification is done before you have any data. The result of identification should apply to any data. So the two separate questions. But what we are trying to estimate depends on the estimand, on the nature of the estimand, which comes from identification exercise. So you get your identification exercise done, which produces an estimand. An estimand is a functional on a distribution that dictates what you should estimate, and then you turn it to the, or you call the statistic departments and ask them whether they have a method of estimating an expression of that nature. Separate problem altogether.
But if for identification in settings where you have a number of units that are exchangeable, then it's easier to separate these things. But if the data are in the form of connected units of a whole network of units, identification kind of requires you to think about what happens if you have an infinite amount of data. And so then it becomes harder to separate that from what inference.
I don't understand why it is hard to separate. Identification problem goes from assumptions to functional, to estimand, okay? So why, if you don't need the data when you do the identification exercise. Do you agree with, are we agreeing on that?
Right. So think about a setting where the data you will eventually, where
I don't need to have a data.
No, so where there's a population of individuals interacting, and they're all interacting in a network, say through a Facebook type friendship network. I want to know what would happen if I changed something in the Facebook experience for everybody, and how should I think about identification there? Because it's not quite clear what the distributions are.
I agree with you. When we have interference among individuals, I haven't studied it. I don't know. There should be some way of translating interference problems into graphs. I haven't studied that. I know that Mansky has done some work on interference and others done. I haven't studied.
What about a setting where there's, say, a policy question? So just to give an example, for example, people are interested in, say, the effect of wearing masks. I mean, so in some ways that connects to what Hito was saying, because you might worry that there are interference effects in the sense that the effect of you wearing a mask may depend on how many other people in your community are wearing masks. But are there not settings where people are interested in a question, a well-defined causal question, but there is a lot of disagreement on what is the exact set of variables that should be controlled for? So, you know, what about a setting where the graph is perhaps not fully known? How should one think about identification in that setting?
It's luckily we have graphs, which means that if the graph is not known, you have the answer there right away, explicitly. You cannot solve the problem. You don't have enough information. And you should be able to graciously give up and say, I don't have enough information, which is a great advantage, which tells you right away that no method whatsoever can supplement your ignorance. So which means you'd give up or ask the question of what do I need to know and what do I need to measure in order to overcome this ignorance so I can identify. I simply don't understand why the lack of graph generates such a traumatic disagreements among researchers. Lack of graph is a beautiful example where you have a call for additional information and additional measurements and additional assumptions.
So, I mean, you have proposed methods that attempt to recover the graph given weak assumptions. So
that's one,
and other people have. So would that also be a?
Yeah, causal discovery is one. Sensitivity analysis is another one. Well, there's a third one, which we shouldn't give up, which is a provisional recommendation, where you bring to the decision maker, whether it is the legislature or your boss, provisional recommendation. Thou shalt do that if you believe that there is no confounder between X and Y, and thou shalt do that if you believe something differently. So the burden on the decision is on the burden of ignorance is on the decision maker, and people are very grateful for the ability to use their own knowledge and their own understanding of a domain, their own expertise in making as a preliminary for decision making. So provisional recommendation is another alternative to sensitivity analysis and causal discovery. And by the way, sensitivity analysis requires graphs. You cannot begin to do sensitivity analysis without the ability to say, I'm going to assume that this, I'm not sure about this arrow, but I assume that all the others remain. Now let me see how penalized I will be if my assumption is wrong. You need graph to do that.
So Judea, just to, because we're getting a bunch of interesting questions from the audience as well. I want to actually ask one more question before that, kind of from that we thought of before. So what areas in the field of causal inference that you feel have a lot of current interest or have a lot of potential for research at the moment? What areas have been neglected so far where you think there's a lot of interesting questions?
I can tell you what I'm going to work on in the next 35 years that I have left. And this is personalized medicine. Or the whole idea of going from population data to individual data. Okay? There is counterfactual logic that helps us under certain circumstances narrow the bound that we get, and we can get personalized medicine done correctly. Right? This is what I'm going to work on. Okay, another area which I'm going to work on is attention and curiosity. We would like robot or computer systems to decide the next experiments to be done, what deserves attention. Attention is a abused commodity that needs to be optimized, and to direct your attention the way that scientists work. Okay, I will spend the next month, says the scientist, right, on this issue and not other, because my span of attention is limited. So this ability to design your own experiments and design your own action and decide what measurements to take, this is what I call attention and curiosity. Okay? And this is also something that we can do today because we have an object which is called a state of understanding, an agent state of mind. I think it's the first time that we have a computer model of what we mean by a state of understanding. And this is the SCM.
Great, thanks.
There's another area which is neglected, in my opinion, which has to do with targeted learning. Okay? Given an estimate, and this is for the statisticians among you, given an estimate, okay, find the best way of decompose it and to estimate it. It's not fully understood. Even on a simple case, which I have a paper on, okay, a Markov chain. What is better, to take the product of the estimate or the estimate of the product? Even that is a highly controversial issue and an intricate issue. I don't think it's well explored.
I agree. Thanks. So we're kind of running short on time, so I think we should now switch to some questions from the audience, possible. So we have one question by Carlos Fernandez Loria, who asked, what's your favorite success story of graphical models being deployed in practice?
My success story?
No, just like.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. My success story is a paper written by Davy, okay, and Kruger, that called the tail wag by the dag, okay, which claims that epidemiology is oppressed by counterfactuals and by DAG, and it should liberate itself from this oppression, okay? Which means that DAGs and counterfactual reasoning have become so prominent in the way that epidemiologists think as a second language, in the way they communicate among themselves, that people like these two authors claim we need to liberate ourselves from this oppression or from this tyranny. Okay? That was the greatest compliment and the most gratifying experience that I have, namely that people in the field communicate, discuss among themselves using this language of DAGs.
Yes, Judea, could you? I think that is a very interesting. There's interesting evidence of the success of the causal inference literature, but Carlos's question I interpreted more as actual practical.
So my answer, my practical is like that. I was fortunate enough to get my tenure without having to mess up with dirty data. Which means that I could spend my time on things that I do better. And I know that not everybody is as fortunate as I've been, okay? But my point is, for me, solving one toy problem is more educational and more gratifying than reading 100 real life stories. I learn nothing from the effect of whatever certain policy in Africa or in India. I learn nothing from it.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, personally, I actually feel it's been very inspiring to see a lot of the empirical work, including by people like Esther Duflo, but also kind of some of the work that's being done in industry as a way of understanding what problems people are grappling with in practice.
Unfortunately, we don't have a ground truth when you are dealing with real problems. Okay? You do something and you say, oh, I've been successful. Whether or not the success is due to your method or despite your method, you never know. Whereas in my toy problems, I can know because I can play around with it. I can change the parameters. I can simulate it. I am the master of, I can take it apart. Yes. So I learn much more from one toy problem than I learn from reading 10 real life problems.
There are people that would argue that you can find out what really happened by doing in biological systems. You can do an intervention, you can do a knockout experiment, you can find out what would happen. So there is quite a lot of work trying to validate causal predictions with experiments. Do you see value in that?
It's nice. What I can say, it's nice. I would not spend the next 35 years of my life in that. I learn much more and I have a joy of discovery in things that I do well. And that's my advice to students too. Do something that you do well.
Well, do something you enjoy. I think otherwise it's very hard to do science.
Correct. That's the most important thing.
So here's another audience question. This came from Kevin Chen. And the question is, what about a setting with credible shape parametric constraints that may aid in identification? So I guess also the question is, how does causal DAGs help with that or fit into situations like that?
A good example is instrumental variable. So you need the assumptions of monotonicity, right? So, of course, if you have, there's nothing holy about lack of error as opposed to assumption of monotonicity. So go ahead. If you believe that, if you assume a certain regression or parametric assumption, a parametric model, and it fits your understanding of a domain, by all means. It's a choice of making the least, it's a choice in the game of making the least assumption to get the most out of it.
So there was a question from Pen Sung about what are your thoughts on incorporating causal thinking in high school and undergraduate education?
I have a student who has been teaching causal graphs in high school, and he said the kids loved it. But this is my only sample, a sample of one, so I cannot generalize. Okay, but look, it makes sense. Let's face it. People think graph. People think in terms of who listens to what. People think in terms of what is the source of variations. Okay, and these are all graphical notions. And so, and in addition, the research in the past few years have proven that you do have here an object, SCL, which performs which completely covers the ladder of causation, okay, which is amazing. That's why I call it the first time in history we have an object that we could say it represents a state of understanding, scientific understanding. So naturally, it should be taught in a graduate school or in an undergraduate school, because that's the way people think about the world. That's the way scientists think in terms of a domain of discourse. And why resist it? So it's natural. As far as graduate schools, I have an advice here. Whoever doesn't know graphs, the better prepare him or herself to find a new job, because the pendulum is going to swing very fairly quickly from what we see today in machine learning, data fitting exercises, into interpretation technology, into science rather than data. So, and there wouldn't be any trained people. There aren't many people. Ask yourself, how many of your students? Well, I know that Thomas has many students who understand graph, but ask, taking a typical economics professor, how many of your students know, for instance, even this operation?
Well, Judea, that's why I had you give a guest lecture last year. So yeah, all my students have seen your work now. So,
but in addition, I'm telling you that when industry discovers that it needs to supplement data fitting with data interpretation, there wouldn't be any people to hire or to train. Okay, so therefore,
I totally agree, and I think industry is there already. I think lots of the tech companies are hiring people who have expertise in causal inference. There's no question about it.
This, by the way, is a mistake. You cannot supplement machine learning with a gimmick of or with a component of causal reasoning. You have to start from scratch, because it is a dramatic tectonic shift. people who invested their career, entire career, assuming that all wisdom comes from data, cannot transfer their allegiance to totally opposite paradigm, saying that you need to supplement. No, you have to start with an understanding, with the causal understanding of the world, and then you use data not as a womb in which you find wisdom, but as an instrument in order to find what's going on in the world. It's a totally different paradigm, and it will not happen without a revolution, without investing at least as much as we invest in data fitting, to invest in causal science for the sake of causal science. I finished my speech for the day. It's a warning. It's a warning to all the machine learning people who are listening. You will be out of a job.
Well, I'm sure there's many people listening to the seminar.